fisherman pulls an empty net from the Pacific at 4 a.m. Every net on every ocean comes up empty. Not one herring, not one tuna, not one sardine. By 5 in the morning, the Coast Guard in Alaska is receiving calls. By 6, Portugal's fishing ministry logs the same report. A vessel south of Madagascar radios in, then one off the coast of New Zealand. The Indian Ocean trawlers turn back empty. The Norwegian Sea Fleet's radio port with nothing in the hold. Captains who have worked these waters for 30 years cannot explain it. The sonar reads water. Nothing moves below. 12 hours earlier, the deep water monitoring stations had noticed a change. A thermal variance. A shift in the acoustic pattern beneath the surface. The stations logged it and moved on. By noon on day 1, the data means something different. Tokyo's Tsukiji fish market closes at 11:47 a.m. It has not closed once in recorded peacetime history. A vendor stands at an empty concrete slab and says nothing. Norway's herring fleet returns to Bergen with zero catch. At the Los Angeles Fish Pier, wholesalers begin making calls. The calls go unanswered. 12 hours into the event, 43 fisheries agencies worldwide have declared emergencies. The word they keep using is unprecedented. Nobody has a second word. What came next? Nobody standing at an empty dock had a framework to understand. The absence felt wrong before anyone understood why. Fishermen are observational scientists. They read the water, they read the current patterns, they read the temperature shifts, they read the bird activity over the surface. That morning, the birds were gone too, not dead, gone. The seabirds that normally follow trawlers across the Pacific were not following. They were standing on rocks along coastlines, not moving. Coast Guard observers in Alaska reported it first, then British Columbia, then Norway. The birds knew before the instruments registered it. The food web they depended on had vanished, and they stood at the edges of the ocean and waited. The global food system runs on fish, not as one ingredient among many, as a structural pillar under everything else. And that pillar just disappeared without warning. 3.4 billion people depend on fish as their primary protein source. Not their preferred source, their primary source. Remove it, and there is no substitute ready. The first price signal hits within 18 hours. Chicken prices rise 11% in the Philippines. In Bangladesh, street markets begin rationing before any government order. In Japan, emergency cabinet meetings start at dawn on day 2. Norway activates its National Food Contingency Protocol for the first time since 1945. 6 countries in sub-Saharan Africa declare food emergency. They do not have a formal mechanism to define it. They use the words available to them. The supermarkets in coastal cities do not yet look different. The shelves are mostly full. People have not panicked. That changes by the end of week 1. What the supermarket shelves hide, the supply chain numbers make visible immediately. There are species of fish the average person has never heard of. They do not appear on menus. They are not sold at markets. They live at depth, in cold water, in the open ocean far from shore. Nobody names them, nobody sees them, but the entire food web runs through them. Anchovies, menhaden, capelin, sprat, sand lance. These are called forage fish. They are the middle layer of every ocean food web on Earth. They eat phytoplankton. They are eaten by larger fish. They are eaten by seabirds. They are eaten by whales. They are eaten by dolphins. They are eaten by tuna, which are eaten by humans. Remove the forage fish, and every layer above them collapses. The forage fish are gone too. They were always part of the disappearance. There is no selective absence. Every fish, everywhere. The forage fish are also the raw material of the global pet food industry. Cat food, dog food, fish oil supplements, omega-3 capsules. They all come from forage fish. Within the first month, every one of those products begins to disappear from store shelves. Nobody expected that connection. Most people did not know it existed. It existed before anyone thought to explain it. The systems that produce inland protein also depend on fish. Aquaculture, farmed salmon, shrimp, tilapia, is not self-sustaining. It runs on fish meal. Fish meal comes from the ocean catch. Without the ocean catch, aquaculture operations worldwide begin shutting down. The shutdowns start within 10 days. Pig farmers in Denmark feed soy, but they also feed fish meal. The substitution math does not work at scale. Soy cannot absorb the entire displaced demand, not at the speed required. Fishing ports are not just supply chains. They are economies. They are communities. They are the reason specific cities exist. Gloucester, Massachusetts, Bergen, Norway, Busan, South Korea, Chittagong, Bangladesh, Manta, Ecuador. These are not fishing towns in a romantic sense. They are industrial-scale processing hubs. They employ hundreds of thousands of workers directly. Within 72 hours of the disappearance, every one of them stops. The boats are docked. The processors have nothing to process. The cold storage sits empty. The truck drivers have no cargo. The net repairers have nothing to fix. The dock workers have no shift. In Chittagong alone, 300,000 people have no income by day 4. There is no safety net large enough to absorb it. No government anywhere is prepared for this. The fishing industry generates $400 billion per year worldwide. It feeds supply chains that touch every continent. Its absence does not create a gap. It creates a collapse that pulls other systems with it. Coastal governments begin issuing emergency declarations. They do not have the institutional vocabulary to write them. The standard playbook covers floods, earthquakes, pandemics. It does not cover the disappearance of all marine life. What the governments were watching publicly, scientists were watching differently in the data. At a deep water monitoring station south of Hawaii, readings had been strange since hour 2. Not dramatic. Strange. Subtle enough that the automated alerts did not trigger. A researcher noticed it manually at noon. She pulled the previous 6 hours. Then the previous 12. The pattern was not random variance. It was directional. 600 meters below the surface, something had shifted. Not the fish. Something smaller. Far smaller. Phytoplankton are single-celled organisms too small to see without a microscope. They have no teeth, no bones, no weight. They live at the surface of every ocean on Earth, and they produce approximately half of all the oxygen in our atmosphere. Every second breath you take today came from an organism you cannot see. For 500 million years, fish kept phytoplankton populations in balance. Small fish ate phytoplankton directly. Larger fish ate the small fish. Every fish in the ocean produced waste. That waste fertilized the phytoplankton layer from below. Iron-rich nutrients cycled upward when fish moved through the water column. Fish excretion was a global nutrient delivery system. It was invisible to everyone on land. It kept the phytoplankton fed, distributed, and regulated. Without fish, that entire system stops at once. What happens to phytoplankton without their predators? Most people never had reason to ask. In the first 48 hours, the phytoplankton blooms. That is not unusual. Blooms happen seasonally, but this one is different in scale. Without small fish eating them, the surface layer thickens faster than any seasonal pattern. By day 3, satellite imagery shows patches of green-brown film across the central Pacific. Monitoring stations in the Atlantic register the same. The Indian Ocean adds a third bloom. All 3 are expanding at rates scientists have never recorded. A dead zone is a region where the ocean's oxygen depletes to 0. Nothing survives in a dead zone. Dead zones form when algae blooms crash. A bloom grows enormous, then it dies. The bacteria that decompose the dead algae consume oxygen. The oxygen disappears. Everything that would have survived in that water dies. What most people understood about dead zones was that they were local. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone is roughly the size of New Jersey. Manageable, regional monitored. On day 4, the Pacific bloom crashes. The dead zone that forms is not the size of New Jersey. It is the size of Australia. The Atlantic bloom follows on day 5, the Indian Ocean on day 6. Oxygen readings in the surface layer of 3 major ocean systems begin to drop. Not dramatically, just enough to register. Just enough that the instruments need recalibration. The baseline has shifted. Ocean oxygen levels have not dropped measurably in recorded scientific history. The instruments exist to confirm they are stable, not to record their decline. What the researchers at those monitoring stations understand, governments have not yet been told. The phytoplankton blooms dying across 3 ocean systems release a chain reaction. Dead phytoplankton sink. As they decompose, bacteria consume oxygen at depth. The oxygen debt compounds, layer by layer. The surface dead zones expand laterally. The deep current systems begin carrying depleted water into the Atlantic circulation. Atmospheric oxygen does not drop immediately. The atmosphere holds enormous reserves. But the production side of the equation has fractured. Half the world's oxygen production just stopped. Not slowed, stopped. What stopped cannot simply restart. The monitoring stations in the Southern Ocean register the first atmospheric shift. This happens at the end of week 2. The reading is within normal margin of error. One researcher notes it in a log. Another looks at the same data and makes a call. That call starts conversations in 11 countries. The public does not hear about them for 3 more weeks. What those conversations contained, only participants can recount. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere are currently 20.9%. Below 19.5%, OSHA classifies an atmosphere as oxygen deficient. Below 16%, cognitive function degrades. Below 6%, loss of consciousness occurs within minutes. The atmosphere is not approaching those numbers yet. Not in week 2, not in month 1. But the direction has changed, and the direction had never changed before. The researchers run the math. They account for atmospheric buffering. They account for terrestrial photosynthesis. The numbers are not immediately catastrophic, but they are not stable. They are moving. Terrestrial plants also produce oxygen, but they are not a substitute at scale. Phytoplankton produce more oxygen per unit than almost any land plant, and land plants depend on stable climate systems. The oceans regulate those systems. Without fish cycling nutrients through the ocean, the phytoplankton cannot recover. The nutrient layers in the deep water become unavailable. The fish that move them vertically are gone. The phytoplankton that survived the dead zone crash have nothing to feed on. The recycling mechanism is broken. The oxygen production system has lost its maintenance crew. What that means at a civilizational timescale, the models are only beginning to run. The food crisis was visible from day 1. The oxygen crisis was invisible until week 2. A third crisis is forming that most governments have not yet named. Fish maintain ocean chemistry, not in a peripheral way, in a structural way. The ocean absorbs roughly 30% of the carbon dioxide the human economy emits. It does this through a chemical exchange process. That process depends on marine biomass cycling carbon from the surface downward. Fish are central to that cycling. Their vertical migration carries carbon compounds deep. It carries nutrients upward. Remove the fish and the carbon pump degrades. The ocean absorbs less carbon dioxide. The atmosphere holds more. Temperatures rise faster. The ocean had been absorbing a third of human emissions quietly. That absorption is now declining. The feedback loop is unwinding. This was not in the emergency briefings issued in week 1. Nobody's emergency framework included the ocean carbon pump. It was background infrastructure, invisible, assumed to be permanent, like the fish. By week 3, 11 countries have classified the event differently. Not a food emergency, a civilizational emergency. The distinction matters. A food emergency has a playbook. A civilizational emergency does not. The UN Security Council convenes a session lasting 7 hours. It produces no resolution. The session is classified. Partial transcripts suggest one conclusion. There is no mechanism for this. No international protocol. No coordinated response architecture. The fish vanished. Every system built on top of them is unwinding, and there is no lever to pull. What happens to the animals that depended on fish? The cameras capture first. They capture it before the briefings can classify it. Marine mammals fed on fish, dolphins, whales, seals, orca. Within the first 2 weeks, hundreds of animals strand on beaches across 6 continents. They are not sick. They are starving. Large animals that survived 50 years of ocean life die on sand. Seabird colonies that nest in millions go silent. The colonies do not fly out to sea. They wait. On day 12, a monitoring station in the Falklands logs a finding. A colony of 3 million rockhopper penguins has not moved in 6 days. The birds are alive. They are waiting for a sea that has nothing in it. Coral reefs, already stressed, begin bleaching. Fish maintain the algae balance on reefs. Without fish, algae overgrows. The coral dies beneath it. Reefs that survive 20 years of bleaching events die in weeks. The open ocean begins to look different. Without fish schools moving through the water column, the visual character changes. Bioluminescence patterns disappear. The surface is still. Divers who go down in the first week describe an absence. Not damage, absence. The ocean is intact. It is just empty. What an empty ocean looks like. Every diver described using a different word. The economic cascade by month 1 is beyond any single model. The fishing industry collapse is visible, but the secondary collapses accumulate without announcements. The pharmaceutical industry loses access to marine-derived compounds. Several compounds used in cancer treatment cannot be synthesized without marine material. They are used in clinical trials running in 7 countries. Production pauses. The tourism industry in coastal regions collapses. Not from public fear, from the absence of the thing people came to see. Reef tourism, sport fishing, marine wildlife watching. That industry is worth $130 billion per year. It stops. Shipping lanes are not directly affected at first, but dead zones expanding across Pacific route corridors create new uncertainty. Vessels begin rerouting. Insurance premiums for trans-Pacific shipping begin to rise. Agricultural fertilizer has a direct link to the ocean. Certain fertilizers are derived from processed fish biomass. The supply line does not break immediately. Within 8 weeks, it becomes measurable. The crops planted next season will face reduced fertilizer availability. That shortfall lands in 17 countries. Those are not wealthy countries. What the fertilizer shortage means for the next harvest, the models run behind closed doors. By month 2, the atmospheric monitoring data escapes classified channels. A researcher in New Zealand publishes the dataset. It is shared 200,000 times in the first 12 hours. The oxygen depletion reading is still technically within normal bounds. It becomes the most discussed number in the world anyway. Governments brief publicly that the readings are within safe margins. This is technically accurate. It does not address the direction. The direction implies something specific. The process that has maintained breathable air is no longer stable. Not broken, not in crisis, not yet, but no longer stable. Stability was the assumption everything was built on. Nobody ever needed to state it. It had never been questioned before. Fish were part of that stability. They were always part of it. We never read the equation. We measured the catch. We never measured the system. Once you start measuring the system, the fish appear everywhere. They appear in the oxygen numbers. They appear in the carbon absorption data. They appear in the nitrogen cycling through reef systems. They appear in the krill populations that blue whales need. They appear in the estuaries where migratory birds feed. They appear in the rivers where bears carry marine nutrients into the forest. Pacific Northwest trees grow larger because of ocean fish, not metaphorically, chemically. The nitrogen from fish carcasses feeds the soil. The trees carry that signature in their rings. The fish were everywhere. They were labeled as food. Labeling them as food made everything else they were invisible. What we could not see, we could not protect. They were an infrastructure, the largest, most distributed living infrastructure on Earth. It maintained the system that maintained us. The scenario also forces a question that real life asks more quietly. At what point does a partial collapse become irreversible? Marine biologists have a term for it, a regime shift. A regime shift is when an ecosystem crosses a threshold. It does not degrade further. It reorganizes. It becomes a different kind of system. The regime shift in the Gulf of Mexico dead zone happened in the 1970s. That dead zone did not exist before then. It exists now. It persists. It has become the new normal, reducing the nutrient runoff that caused it would shrink it, but it would not eliminate it. The system is now organized around its presence. The Grand Banks had a regime shift too. After the cod collapsed, capelin exploded, shrimp exploded, snow crab expanded. The ecosystem did not die. It became something else, something profitable to some fishermen, something unrecognizable to anyone who fished there before. A global regime shift is what the scenario models, not extinction. Reorganization. The ocean does not die. It becomes a different ocean, one where the organisms that dominated for 500 million years are gone, one where the system that maintained breathable air runs on a degraded engine, one where the feedback loops that stabilize the climate are slower and weaker. A different ocean, in a different world, with the same humans trying to survive in it. In the scenario, no one caused it, no one chose it. The fish simply vanished, and everything built on top of them began coming apart. The food system within days, the coastal economies within weeks, the marine ecosystems within months, the oxygen production within a year, the climate regulation over decades. Nobody noticed until the plates were empty, not because the signals were not there. The signals were always there. In the phytoplankton counts, in the dead zone reports, in the nutrient depletion data, in the trawl surveys showing declining biomass year after year, in the coral bleaching events getting worse every cycle. The signals were published, they were peer-reviewed, they were filed. Nobody translated them into the single sentence that mattered. The sentence was, "We are using the ocean like a warehouse. It is a machine. We never read the manual. We had this moment once before." At smaller scale, the Grand Banks off Newfoundland were the most productive fishing grounds on Earth. Cod were so thick that early fishermen claimed you could walk on their backs. That was not a myth. That was contemporaneous reporting from 1497. The cod were there in volumes that seemed infinite. They were fished and fished and fished. In 1992, the Canadian government closed the Grand Banks entirely. The cod stock had collapsed. 500 years of abundance, gone in decades. 35,000 people lost their livelihoods. The cod never fully recovered. The ecosystem shifted. It became dominated by shrimp and crab instead. The cod that had organized the entire system were gone, and the system reorganized around their absence. The Grand Banks also told us something about how humans respond to collapse. The fishermen saw it coming. The scientists published the data. The government commissioned reviews. The reviews recommended smaller catch limits. The fishing industry lobbied against them. The government delayed. By the time the moratorium came in 1992, the cod were already gone. The moratorium did not save the cod. It acknowledged they were already lost. What the Grand Banks collapse told us, most governments filed and forgot. A collapse of one species in one region took 30 years to become undeniable. A collapse of all species across all oceans produces consequences in hours. The speed difference is the part the scenario makes visible. The fisherman pulling the empty net at 4 a.m. was the last signal. By then, it was too late to be a warning. It was just a report. We treated the ocean like a stock, something to draw from, a resource defined by what it would give us. What the ocean actually was is not how we described it. It was a living system, maintaining the conditions for complex life. That was never the frame we used, not in policy, not in economics, not in the language we built around the sea. We had a word for the fish we caught. We called it a catch. We did not have a word for what the fish were doing, not when we were not catching them. They were running the oxygen systems, they were cycling the nutrients, they were regulating the blooms, they were feeding the forests, they were cooling the planet. Nobody billed us for any of it. Nobody sent an invoice. The service was free, and so it was invisible. And so it was treated as permanent, until it was not. Every breath you take contains oxygen the ocean helped produce. The fish were always part of that process. We only noticed them when the plate was empty. We built a civilization on a system we never fully understood. We fed 3.5 billion people with it. We breathed because of it. We are still breathing because of it. Most people never thought about what fish actually were. The first time they did was the morning the nets came up empty. That morning is a thought experiment. The scenario is hypothetical. The fish have not vanished, not yet. But the phytoplankton counts are declining. The dead zones are expanding. The trawl surveys trend down. The coral bleaching events get worse every cycle. The signals are being published. They are peer-reviewed. They are filed. There are places where the scenario has already partially happened. Not globally, locally. The Aral Sea, the largest lake in Central Asia. In 1960, it was the fourth largest lake in the world. Soviet irrigation projects diverted the rivers that fed it. By 2007, it had shrunk to 10% of its original size. The fishing industry that fed the surrounding region for centuries disappeared. The boats are still there. They sit in the sand, hundreds of kilometers from the current shoreline. The ecosystem they fished does not exist anymore. The communities built around them do not exist in the same form. People left, the ones who stayed adapted to a different landscape. A landscape that the previous generation would not have recognized. The Aral Sea is not an ocean. It is a preview. It shows what happens when the assumption of permanence meets the reality of depletion. The assumption held for a long time. It held right up until it didn't. The ocean is not the Aral Sea. It is larger. The buffering mechanisms are more powerful. The threshold is further away. But the direction is the same. And thresholds do not announce themselves in advance. They appear in the data after they have been crossed. The data is saying it right now. Published, peer-reviewed, filed. The direction is moving. The phytoplankton counts are lower than they were 50 years ago. The dead zones are more numerous. The trawl survey numbers trend. The coral systems bleach more frequently. The sentence nobody is writing is the same one that mattered in the scenario. We are using the ocean like a warehouse. It is a machine. We have never read the manual. The net is still coming up full, for now. But the average global catch has been declining since 1996. Not in every fishery, not every year, but the trend line across 30 years bends downward. More boats, more technology, more fuel, more time at sea, less catch. The effort is increasing. The yield is decreasing. That is not a stable system. That is a system approaching a limit. The scenario asks what the limit looks like when it arrives all at once. History suggests it does not arrive all at once. It arrives slowly, then it arrives quickly, and then it is only visible in the data that was already there. The nets are still coming up full, somewhere, for now.